When feral working class beauty clashes with elite Hollywood wealth over the exact same man, the loser does not just get a broken heart. She gets a rubber bite block. Louise Rayner won this lethal tug-of-war without shedding a single tear. She simply froze her husband's bank accounts, forcing him to surrender his beautiful mistress to the studio executioners. While the untouchable queen kept her Academy Awards and her silk sheets, Frances Farmer was dragged into a concrete cell and pumped with raw voltage until a rival was permanently erased. The late 1930s was an era of absolute totalitarian control. The major studios, Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, did not just produce motion pictures. They functioned as sovereign states. They owned the cameras, the distribution networks, the newspapers, the judges, and the police chiefs. Within this closed ecosystem, human beings were categorized strictly by their proximity to capital. You were either a protected asset or you were disposable inventory. Louise Rayner occupied the absolute summit of this hierarchy. By 1938, she achieved something no other actor in the history of the industry had accomplished. She won consecutive Academy Awards for Best Actress. She was European, refined, and aggressively protected by the studio machinery. She represented the Hollywood aristocracy. She did not merely possess acting talent. She possessed a bulletproof corporate shield. Louise Rayner was untouchable. She understood that power in Hollywood was not about shouting. It was about leveraging status. A queen does not engage in public screaming matches with a peasant. She uses her position to ensure the peasant is quietly removed from the premises. Frances Farmer was the exact opposite. Born in Seattle, she arrived in Hollywood with a fierce, burning intellect and a striking, aggressive beauty. But she lacked a pedigree. Crucially, she lacked a corporate sponsor. More terrifyingly for the Hollywood elite, Frances possessed a raw, feral energy that no amount of studio grooming could replicate. She was the ultimate nightmare for a refined, established wife. Frances did not have Louise's expensive silk gowns or her curated European poise, but she had an untamed, breathtaking physical presence. It is the primal fear of every woman at the top of the hierarchy. The sudden appearance of a wild, breathtakingly beautiful rival who refuses to play by the rules, threatening to burn down the manicured life the wife has so carefully built. Frances possessed a fatal flaw. Her flaw was not mental illness. Her flaw was arrogance. She suffered from the working class delusion that raw talent and physical beauty could bypass the rigid class structures of the studio system. She despised the superficiality of Hollywood. She refused to play the public relations game. She refused to smile for the columnists. She refused to date the approved leading men. And she refused to be packaged as a docile blonde commodity. Frances believed her intellect made her superior to the system. She believed she could manipulate the men who wrote the scripts and ran the boardrooms. She was dangerously naive. The man who proved her wrong was Clifford Odets. Odets was the celebrated playwright of the Group Theater in New York. He was the golden boy of the American left-wing theater movement. He wrote passionate, fiery dialogue about the struggles of the working class. He championed the proletariat on paper. But in reality, Odets lived in terrified thrall to the Hollywood elite. He was a hypocrite of monumental proportions. He enjoyed the immense prestige and the massive financial security of being married to a two-time Oscar winner like Louise Rayner. He lived in the mansions. He attended the exclusive dinners. Yet he possessed a predatory appetite for younger, unprotected women. Odets used his intellectual aura to lure Frances Farmer. He offered her something the studio system denied her, artistic legitimacy. He cast her as the lead in his hit play, Golden Boy. To Frances, Odets represented a lifeline to serious acting. He was the intellectual savior who would rescue her from the B-movies of Paramount Pictures. To Odets, Frances was a disposable biological asset. She was a beautiful, rebellious muse who stroked his ego and satisfied his physical desires while he remained safely tethered to his elite marriage. The triangle was inherently unstable. It was built on a foundation of exploitation and cowardice. Frances Farmer believed the affair was a partnership of equals. She believed Odets would leave his wife and validate her status as his true intellectual and romantic equal. But Frances fundamentally misunderstood the economics of the situation. She failed to calculate the sheer gravity of Louise Rayner's corporate power. When the affair inevitably breached the walls of their secrecy, the collision was swift and clinically brutal. Louise Rayner discovered her husband's infidelity. In a lesser ecosystem, this discovery might lead to a public scandal. It might lead to divorce courts splashed across the front pages of the tabloids. But the Hollywood elite do not operate in the public sphere unless it serves their financial interests. Louise Rayner did not confront Frances Farmer. She did not grant the feral mistress the dignity of an acknowledgement. She turned her attention entirely to her husband, and she utilized the most devastating weapon in a wealthy wife's arsenal: total financial castration. Louise did not cry. She audited him. She deployed the silent, crushing weight of her status to make it entirely clear to Clifford Odets that his comfortable, elite lifestyle was heavily subsidized by her immense Hollywood power. The mansions, the cars, the elite invitations, the studio backing, it all belonged to her. Louise silently laid out the terms of his surrender. If Odets chose the beautiful, wild mistress, he would lose the credit line. He would be locked out of the Hollywood kingdom and reduced to a struggling, impoverished playwright, faced with a choice between a fiery, rebellious mistress and his own financial security. The champion of the working class did not hesitate. Odets chose his wallet. He executed his betrayal with cowardly precision. Golden Boy was scheduled to transfer to the prestigious London stage. This was the role that was supposed to secure Frances Farmer's legacy as a serious, legitimate dramatic actress. It was her escape route. Odets quietly severed her from the production. He replaced her with a safer, less volatile actress. He packed his bags, walked away from the woman he claimed to love, and boarded a ship to Europe. He stood beside his legally protected Oscar-winning wife, leaving his mistress behind in the dirt. Frances Farmer was left standing in the wreckage. The humiliation was absolute and paralyzing. She realized in a moment of brutal clarity that she was never a muse. She was a cheap rental. She had been sacrificed by a coward to appease a queen. She was a working-class girl who had dared to step onto the elite board, and she had been ruthlessly swept off it by the very man who invited her to play. The architecture of Hollywood in the 1930s was designed to crush dissent. Paramount Pictures, the studio that held Frances Farmer's contract, was a factory that demanded total obedience. When a young woman signed a contract, she signed away her bodily autonomy. The studio dictated her diet, her wardrobe, and her public associations. Frances fought this control from the moment she arrived in Los Angeles. She drove a battered old car instead of a studio-issued limousine. She refused to wear makeup off set. She actively avoided the Mocambo and the Trocadero. The nightclubs where stars were expected to parade themselves for the press. Paramount executives viewed this behavior not as eccentricity, but as insubordination. A star who does not care about glamour is a star who cannot be easily controlled by the threat of losing it. Frances was a lucrative asset, but she was a volatile one. The studio executives were merely waiting for an opportunity to break her spirit or discard her entirely. Clifford Odets provided that opportunity. The affair with Odets was Frances Farmer's attempt to circumvent the studio hierarchy. If she could establish herself as a serious stage actress in New York, she would no longer be dependent on Paramount's B-movie assembly line. Odets was the key to unlocking the gate, but Odets was a lock that belonged to Louise Rayner. Louise Rayner's power was unprecedented. Winning 2 Academy Awards in a row gave her a level of leverage that terrified even the studio bosses. She had proven that she was not just a passing trend, she was a critical darling and a box office powerhouse. When she looked at Clifford Odets and demanded the removal of Frances Farmer, she was not speaking as a wounded wife. She was speaking as a multi-million-dollar corporation demanding the liquidation of a toxic asset. Odets' capitulation was total. He did not just break off the affair. He systematically dismantled Frances's professional escape route. By firing her from the London production of Golden Boy, he stranded her. He forced her back into the waiting arms of Paramount Pictures. He delivered her back to the factory floor, completely stripped of her confidence and her leverage. The betrayal severed Frances Farmer's grip on reality. The arrogance that had fueled her survival was shattered. She realized that talent was useless against capital. She recognized that the men who wrote the brilliant, empathetic words on the stage were the same men who would slit your throat in the boardroom to protect their own comfort. This was the opening move of the destruction. The wife had secured her property. The husband had proven his obedience, and the mistress was left bleeding out on the pavement. But simply discarding Frances Farmer was not enough. In the ecosystem of Hollywood, a discarded woman with a loud voice, a sharp intellect, and a legitimate grievance is an unacceptable corporate liability. If Frances was allowed to remain in the industry, she might speak. She might expose the hypocrisy of the playwright and the cruelty of the elite. The industry needed to silence her permanently. They needed to discredit her before she could threaten the pristine narrative of the Golden Age. The betrayal by Odets was merely the catalyst. It triggered a chain reaction that would activate the darkest, most terrifying machinery of the studio system. The psychological warfare was about to transition into physical captivity. The elite had drawn the blood. Now the corporation would clean up the mess. The train ride from New York to Los Angeles is 3,000 miles. For Frances Farmer, returning to the West Coast after her dismissal from Golden Boy, those 3,000 miles were a slow, agonizing funeral procession. She was not returning as a conquering theatrical star. She was returning as a deported exile. She stepped off the train at Union Station stripped of her leverage. Clifford Odets had not just broken her heart, he had broken her shield. By firing her and fleeing to Europe with Louise Rayner, Odets had signaled to the entire Hollywood establishment that Frances Farmer was unprotected. In the brutal ecology of the 1930s studio system, an unprotected woman is bleeding bait in shark-infested waters. Paramount Pictures was waiting for her. The executives at Paramount did not view Frances as a wounded human being requiring support. They viewed her as a defective product that had embarrassed the company. Frances had openly despised the studio's material. She had fought with directors. She had publicly demanded better scripts and mocked the superficiality of the Hollywood press. The studio had tolerated this insubordination only because she was generating capital. But now, she was returning defeated, publicly humiliated by a New York playwright. Her market value had dropped. Paramount decided it was time to break the wild horse. They did not sit her down for a disciplinary meeting. They utilized a far more insidious method of control. They activated the public relations machinery. In the golden age of Hollywood, the publicity department of a major studio was not a marketing team. It was an intelligence agency and a propaganda wing. The studio controlled the flow of information to the American public with totalitarian efficiency. They maintained a vast network of complicit journalists, magazine editors, and syndicated columnists. This network was designed to manufacture gods and goddesses, but it was equally equipped to execute character assassinations. Paramount needed to alter the narrative surrounding Frances Farmer. She was previously known as the rebellious intellectual, the girl who drove a battered Ford and refused to wear makeup. This image, while annoying to the executives, still granted her a certain degree of respect. It made her look principled. The studio needed to strip away that principle. They needed to downgrade her rebellion into pathology. They needed the public to stop seeing her as an independent thinker and start seeing her as a hysterical liability. To accomplish this, Paramount deployed the heavy artillery, Louella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. History remembers Parsons and Hopper as gossip columnists, frivolous women wearing ridiculous hats, writing about who attended which party. This is a fatal underestimation of their power. Parsons and Hopper were the corporate enforcers of the studio system. They possessed syndicated columns that reached tens of millions of American households every morning. They dictated the moral parameters of the nation. They had the power to greenlight a career with a compliment or obliterate it with a blind item. They operated in direct collusion with the studio heads. Louis B. Mayer, Jack Warner, and the executives at Paramount fed them information. In exchange for exclusive scoops, Parsons and Hopper acted as the executioners for any actor who stepped out of line. Paramount fed Frances Farmer to them. The campaign was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It began subtly. A brief mention in Louella Parsons' column noting that Frances looked tired and disheveled at a restaurant. A whisper in Hedda Hopper's column about Frances being uncooperative on set. Then the volume escalated. The stories became darker, more targeted. The columnists began to report on her drinking. They did not frame her alcohol consumption as the coping mechanism of a woman suffering from profound betrayal and professional sabotage. They framed it as a moral failing. They branded her unpredictable. They used words like erratic, difficult, and hysterical. This vocabulary was specifically chosen. In the 1940s, labeling a woman hysterical was not a casual insult. It was a clinical diagnosis weaponized for social control. It immediately invalidated everything the woman said. If Frances Farmer complained about the grueling 14-hour workdays, the press dismissed it as the whining of a crazy woman. If she demanded a script with actual dramatic depth instead of playing a passive blonde, it was framed as the irrational demands of a lunatic. The public humiliation was total, and it was entirely asymmetrical. Frances could not fight back. She did not own a printing press. She did not have a syndicated column. Every time she tried to defend herself to a reporter, her anger was used as further proof of her instability. The studio had placed her in a psychological chokehold. If she remained silent, the lies became the official record. If she screamed, she confirmed the diagnosis. This is the true violence of a corporate smear campaign. It isolates the target. The rest of the Hollywood community watched the destruction of Frances Farmer and collectively stepped back. Actors who had previously worked with her stopped calling. Directors who had praised her talent suddenly found her too risky to cast. They did not abandon her because they believed the lies. They abandoned her because they recognized the mechanics of the execution. They knew that Paramount had issued a kill order. In Hollywood, proximity to a sinking ship guarantees you will drown with it. The silence of her peers was not born of malice, it was born of absolute paralyzing fear. They watched the machine tear Frances apart and silently thanked God they were not the ones in the crosshairs. While Frances was being crucified in the press, 3,000 miles away, the architects of her initial destruction remained perfectly insulated. Louise Rayner, the two-time Oscar winner, sat in pristine silence. Her reputation remained completely untouched. The press did not dare drag the First Lady of the Academy into a messy tabloid scandal. The studio machinery that was currently shredding Frances Farmer was the exact same machinery protecting Louise Rayner. The contrast was a brutal demonstration of class power. The aristocratic wife kept her hands clean while the system did the dirty work on her behalf. Clifford Odets, the cowardly playwright, remained similarly untouched. The press did not brand him a predator. They did not label him erratic or hysterical for abandoning his production and fleeing to Europe. The patriarchal ecosystem of Hollywood forgave men for infidelity as a matter of course. Odets was allowed to return to his typewriter, his bank accounts intact, his elite status preserved by the corporate shield of his wife. Frances Farmer was left alone to absorb the kinetic impact of the entire studio system. The pressure fractured her. She was a highly intelligent, deeply sensitive woman trapped in a panopticon. Everywhere she went, she was watched, judged, and documented by enemies. The betrayal by Odets had destroyed her trust in human connection. The coordinated attack by the press destroyed her professional identity. She began to self-medicate. The drinking, which had previously been a social habit, became a desperate biological imperative to numb the noise. The alcohol stripped away her remaining filters. The studio had branded her a volatile monster, and cornered by the system, she began to give them exactly the monster they demanded. Her behavior became genuinely self-destructive, but it was the self-destruction of an animal chewing off its own leg to escape a steel trap. She engaged in shouting matches with studio executives. She openly mocked the producers who tried to force her into submissive roles. She was fighting a war she had already lost, utilizing the only weapon she had left, her rage. But rage without power is just noise. And Paramount Pictures knew exactly how to silence noise. The studio executives recognized that the smear campaign had achieved its primary objective. The public no longer viewed Frances Farmer as a star. The public viewed her as a problem. The narrative of her insanity had been successfully implanted into the American consciousness. This was the prerequisite for the final phase of the operation. You cannot simply arrest a beloved movie star. The public will riot. But if you spend 2 years convincing the public that the star is a dangerous, unpredictable lunatic, her removal becomes an act of public safety. The studio had successfully dehumanized her. They had transformed her from a human being into a nuisance. Paramount Pictures stopped protecting her from the local authorities. In the past, if a valuable star was pulled over for drunk driving, the studio fixers would arrive before the police could even write the ticket. The fixers would bribe the officers, confiscate the police report, and drive the star home. The incident would never exist. For Frances, the fixers stopped coming. The shield was deliberately deactivated. In October 1942, Frances Farmer was pulled over by the Santa Monica police for driving with her headlights on high beam in a wartime blackout zone. The police suspected she was intoxicated. In a normal Hollywood scenario, this would have been a non-issue. A phone call to Paramount would have erased the arrest. But Frances was alone. She was agitated. She was terrified. She argued with the police officers. She was arrested and taken to the station. The next morning, the incident was plastered across the front pages of every newspaper in Los Angeles. The press, tipped off by the authorities and greenlit by the studio, descended upon the story like vultures. They printed photographs of her looking disheveled, bruised, and exhausted. They did not report the story as a simple traffic violation. They reported it as the inevitable explosion of the mad woman of Hollywood. This arrest was the tripwire. It was the legal justification the system needed to transition Frances from corporate punishment to state-sanctioned captivity. The studio had washed its hands of her. They had pushed her to the edge of the cliff, handed her a bottle of gin, and waited for her to fall. When she finally fell, Paramount Pictures did not reach out to catch her. They reached out to the judges. They reached out to the medical establishment. The corporate execution was complete. The physical incarceration was about to begin. The concrete walls of the asylum were waiting to finish the job that Louise Rayner, Clifford Odets, and the Hollywood press had started. The arrest of Frances Farmer in October 1942 was not the climax of her destruction. It was merely the administrative handover. It was the precise moment the corporate machinery of Paramount Pictures transferred jurisdiction of their broken asset to the judicial system of Los Angeles County. When a valuable star was arrested in the golden age of Hollywood, a highly choreographed protocol was immediately activated. Studio fixers, armed with briefcases full of untraceable cash, would arrive at the police precinct before the ink on the booking sheet was dry. The desk sergeant would be compensated. The arresting officers would be commended and paid off. The police report would vanish into an incinerator. The star would wake up the next morning in their own bed, and the public would never know a crime had occurred. The studio system operated above the law because the studio system funded the law. Frances Farmer sat in a concrete holding cell in Santa Monica and waited for the fixers. She waited for the studio lawyers to walk through the iron doors, post her bail, and scold her for being careless. She waited for the corporate shield to descend. The shield never came. Paramount Pictures deliberately allowed her to sit in the cell. They allowed the booking process to proceed legally and publicly. They allowed the police to notify the press. The studio executives sat in their offices on Melrose Avenue and watched the trap snap shut. They had spent 2 years laying the groundwork, feeding the gossip columnists stories of her instability, and systematically dismantling her professional reputation. Now the state was doing the heavy lifting for them. The morning after her arrest, Frances was paraded into a municipal courtroom. The room was packed with photographers. The blinding explosion of magnesium flashbulbs captured her without studio lighting, without makeup, looking exhausted, terrified, and furious. The resulting photographs were splashed across the front pages of every major newspaper in the country. The visual narrative was locked in place. The glamorous movie star had officially degraded into a common criminal. This was the trigger Paramount needed to execute the final corporate severance. In every studio contract of the era, there existed a lethal legal mechanism known as the Morals Clause. This clause stipulated that the studio could immediately terminate an actor's contract without severance or penalty if the actor conducted themselves in a manner that offended public decency or brought the studio into disrepute. It was a blank check for corporate assassination. Paramount invoked the Morals Clause. They did not fire Frances Farmer for demanding better scripts. They did not fire her for fighting with directors or refusing to conform to the blonde bombshell archetype. They fired her because she was a convicted, drunk driver who had embarrassed the corporation. They washed their hands of her with perfect, unassailable legal justification. The termination of her contract was a financial death sentence. Frances was stripped of her weekly salary. She was blacklisted across the industry. No other studio would hire a woman who had been publicly fired under a morals clause and branded a lunatic by Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. The corporate embargo was absolute. Frances retreated to the Knickerbocker Hotel in Hollywood. She was isolated, unemployable, and broke. The psychological toll of the previous 3 years, the betrayal by Clifford Odets, the silent complicity of Louise Rayner, the relentless public humiliation, and the final corporate excommunication converged in that hotel room. The justice system, acting in tandem with the press, did not leave her alone. The judge who presided over her traffic violation had sentenced her to 180 days in jail, but suspended the sentence on the condition of strict probation. This was not an act of judicial mercy. It was a leash. It kept Frances permanently tethered to the state. It ensured that any minor infraction, any display of anger or non-compliance would result in immediate incarceration. Frances was a woman who had spent her entire life fighting for autonomy. She had fought her mother in Seattle. She had fought the executives at Paramount. Now, she was ordered to report to a probation officer, to submit to regular interrogations about her behavior, and to ask permission from the state to simply exist. She refused to comply. She stopped reporting to her probation officer. She locked herself in a room at the Knickerbocker Hotel and tried to shut out the world that had consumed her. The state response was immediate, violent, and highly theatrical. In January 1943, the police did not send a single officer with a warrant to the Knickerbocker Hotel. They sent a squad. They alerted the press beforehand. When Frances refused to open her door, the police broke it down. What followed was a horrific spectacle of state-sanctioned violence designed explicitly for public consumption. The police officers dragged Frances Farmer out of her hotel room. She was naked. She fought them with the sheer, desperate panic of a cornered animal. She screamed. She kicked. She demanded her rights. The police wrestled her down the hallway, through the lobby of the hotel, and out into the blinding daylight, throwing a shower curtain over her struggling body. The photographers captured every second of the assault. The images were grotesque. They showed a woman completely stripped of her humanity, flanked by burly men in uniform, her face contorted in absolute rage and terror. The public consumed these images not as evidence of police brutality, but as definitive visual proof of her insanity. The media framed her resistance not as a human being fighting a violent home invasion, but as the uncontrollable thrashing of a madwoman. This was the climax of the public humiliation campaign. Louise Rayner and Clifford Odets were living comfortably in elite social circles, their reputations pristine, while the woman they had destroyed was being dragged naked across the front pages of the American press. The class warfare was complete. The aristocracy remained spotless. The working class threat was reduced to a public freak show. Frances was hauled back before a municipal judge named Marshall Hickson. The courtroom was a circus. The press gallery was packed to capacity. The entire proceeding was a kangaroo court, designed not to dispense justice, but to publicly execute her civil rights. Frances stood before the judge bruised, unwashed, and furious. She did not play the role of the repentant victim. She didn't weep and beg for mercy. She possessed a searing, articulate intelligence, and she used it to attack the court. She demanded to know why her civil rights were being violated. She demanded legal representation. She pointed at the police officers and accused them of assault. She pointed at the journalists and accused them of operating a smear campaign. Judge Hickson did not engage with her legal arguments. The system does not debate with defective property. Hickson looked at the furious, articulate woman standing before him and simply declared her mentally unstable. Frances realized in that exact moment that the law was a fiction. The courtroom was just an extension of the studio boardroom. They had already decided her fate before she walked through the doors. The anger that had been building inside her for years, the anger at Odets, at Paramount, at the columnists, at the police, boiled over. In a final, desperate act of physical defiance, Frances grabbed a heavy glass inkwell from the defense table and hurled it at the judge. It missed him, smashing against the wall and splattering dark ink across the wood paneling. It was the physical manifestation of her rage against the machine. The bailiffs tackled her to the ground. She fought them, knocking a policeman down, screaming that the court was corrupt, that the entire system was a fascist dictatorship designed to crush anyone who refused to conform. The gavel fell. The sentence was passed. The municipal court did not send Frances Farmer to a standard county jail. They utilized a far more devastating legal mechanism. They transferred jurisdiction of her body from the penal system to the medical system. Frances was dragged out of the courtroom, strapped to a stretcher, and thrown into the back of an ambulance. She was committed to the psychiatric ward of Los Angeles General Hospital. The transition from criminal defendant to psychiatric patient is the most profound loss of liberty a human being can experience. A criminal has a release date, a criminal has a lawyer, a criminal has a constitutional right to due process. A psychiatric patient has nothing. When the iron doors of the Los Angeles General Hospital psychiatric ward locked behind Frances Farmer, she ceased to be a citizen of the United States. She became the legal property of the medical establishment. This is how the Hollywood elite handled their refuse. They did not dirty their own hands. They outsourced the disposal to psychiatrists and orderlies. The medical system provided a clean clinical sanitization of corporate destruction. Paramount Pictures could point to the hospital and say, "We did not destroy her career. She was simply sick." Clifford Odets could point to the hospital and say, "I did not abandon her. She lost her mind." The asylum was the ultimate alibi for the abusers. Inside the psychiatric ward of Los Angeles General Hospital, the brutal reality of mid-century psychiatry descended upon her. In the 1940s, mental institutions were not places of healing. They were holding pens. They were warehouses for the unwanted, the rebellious, and the inconvenient. The primary goal of the medical staff was not to cure the patient, but to enforce total, absolute compliance. Frances was stripped of her clothing. She was forced into a coarse canvas gown. She was locked in a barren cell. The environment was designed to strip away every remaining shred of human dignity. The doctors didn't speak to her as an intelligent woman. They spoke to her as a diseased organism. They ignored her articulate arguments about the corruption of the studio system, logging her accusations as symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. The more she tried to explain the conspiracy that had destroyed her life, the more the doctors noted her delusions of persecution. Her intelligence was weaponized against her. The Los Angeles General Hospital was merely a processing center. After a brief period of observation, where she was repeatedly tranquilized and subjected to endless degrading psychological evaluations, the medical board made their final determination. They diagnosed her with manic depressive psychosis. They declared her legally incompetent. The state revoked her financial autonomy, voided her legal capacity, and denied her the right to refuse medical intervention. The fierce, independent intellectual who had defied the executives of Paramount Pictures was reduced to the legal status of an infant. She was loaded onto a guarded train and transferred out of Los Angeles. She was shipped hundreds of miles north to the Kimball Sanitarium in La Crescenta, and eventually to the sprawling, notoriously overcrowded Western State Hospital in Washington. The geography of her imprisonment was deliberate. They removed her from the epicenter of her trauma and buried her in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. They erased her from the map. Western State Hospital was a nightmare constructed of brick, iron bars, and screaming patients. It was a massive, underfunded state institution housing thousands of inmates in conditions that resembled a medieval dungeon. The ward smelled of feces, bleach, and unwashed bodies. The orderlies were underpaid, overworked, and frequently resorted to physical violence to maintain order among the inmates. This was the final destination for the woman who had dared to sleep with Louise Rayner's husband. The torture began immediately. Mid-century psychiatric treatments were inherently violent. They were designed to shock the brain into submission, operating on the crude theory that inducing massive physical trauma would somehow reset the neural pathways. Frances Farmer was subjected to hydrotherapy. This was not a relaxing bath. She was stripped naked, thrown into a steel tub, and submerged in freezing water for hours at a time. Canvas restraints were strapped across the tub, pinning her beneath the icy water until her lips turned blue and her muscles locked in agonizing cramps. The doctors stood by, taking notes, watching the rebellious actress shiver uncontrollably until her will to fight was temporarily frozen out of her. When the ice baths failed to produce the required docility, the doctors escalated the voltage. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was the preferred method of behavioral modification in state asylums. Frances was dragged into a clinical room. She was strapped down to a rigid gurney. Thick leather belts were buckled across her chest, her thighs, and her wrist to prevent her bones from snapping during the induced seizures. A rubber block was forced between her teeth so she would not bite through her own tongue. Electrodes were smeared with conductive gel and clamped to her temples. The doctor threw the switch. A massive surge of raw electricity tore through her frontal lobes. The voltage hijacked her central nervous system. Her body arched off the table in a violent, rigid spasm. Her eyes rolled back into her skull. The electricity burned through the synapses, scrambling her memories, erasing her short-term recall, and short-circuiting the very intellect that had defined her existence. When the current was cut, she collapsed back onto the gurney, unconscious, drooling, and completely pliable. She would wake up hours later in a fog of terrifying confusion. She would not remember her name. She would not remember why she was locked in a cell. The memories of the Hollywood sound stages, the script of Golden Boy, the face of Clifford Odets, and the blinding flashbulbs of the press were temporarily burned away, replaced by a blinding, white void. The hospital administered these electroshock treatments not once or twice, but in relentless, punishing series. Dozens of shocks, hundreds of volts. The procedure was specifically designed to shatter the ego. It was an assault on the core identity of the human being. The doctors were not treating an illness. They were conducting an exorcism. They were trying to burn the rebellion out of her brain. The home wrecker was paying the ultimate price for her transgression. Louise Rayner had remained silent, relying on the class structure to protect her. Clifford Odets had run away, relying on his cowardice to survive. Paramount Pictures had invoked a legal clause, relying on their corporate power to dispose of the liability. The columnists had printed the lies, relying on their syndicated reach to manipulate the public. And Frances Farmer absorbed the collective violence of all of them. Strapped to a table, her brain actively burning under the jurisdiction of the state. The architecture of Western State Hospital was not designed for rehabilitation. It was designed for containment. Located in Steilacoom, Washington, the facility was a sprawling Gothic fortress built to hide the human refuse of the Pacific Northwest. In the 1940s, it operated at a catastrophic overcapacity. Thousands of inmates were packed into wards designed for hundreds. It was a holding pen, functioning on a brutal economy of scale. When Frances Farmer was deposited into this system, the final traces of her civilian identity were systematically eradicated. The state operates with a ruthless bureaucratic efficiency. The intake process stripped her of her personal clothing, her jewelry, and her name. She was issued a coarse, ill-fitting canvas dress. She was assigned a number. The Hollywood actress who had commanded millions of dollars at the box office, who had memorized Shakespeare and argued with studio executives, was reduced to a unit of inventory in a state-run warehouse. The conditions inside the wards were an exercise in calculated degradation. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, industrial bleach, and human waste. The noise was constant, a ceaseless echoing cacophony of screams, weeping, and the hollow rhythmic pacing of the permanently medicated. The ratio of patients to psychiatric staff was staggering. rendering any form of individual therapy impossible. The medical professionals did not practice psychiatry. They practiced crowd control. Survival in Western State Hospital required total, absolute submission. The orderlies held absolute power. They were underpaid, overworked, and entirely unsupervised. They utilized physical violence as the primary method of enforcing compliance. Inmates who spoke out of turn, inmates who refused to eat the gray, nutrient-deficient slop served in the cafeteria, or inmates who dared to display anger were immediately targeted. Frances Farmer possessed a lifetime of anger. The fire that Paramount Pictures and Clifford Odets had tried to extinguish still burned inside her, fueled by the sheer, suffocating injustice of her incarceration. She fought the orderlies. She refused to submit to the daily humiliations. The state responded by escalating the punishment. The medical files from Western State Hospital detail a regime of pharmacological and physical restraints that border on torture. Frances was frequently injected with massive doses of formaldehyde, a primitive, foul-smelling sedative that knocked her unconscious for days. When she woke, she was often bound in a straitjacket, her arms locked across her chest, abandoned in a solitary confinement cell to lie in her own excrement until her spirit broke. The vulnerability of female inmates in these state-run facilities was absolute. A woman declared legally insane has no voice. If she reports abuse, her report is logged as a delusion. If she points to a bruise, the staff claims she inflicted it upon herself during a manic episode. She is a perfect silent victim. Historical accounts and biographies surrounding Frances Farmer's time at Western State Hospital point to a terrifying pattern of systemic abuse. The hospital was located near a military base. Due to the severe understaffing during the war years, security was dangerously porous. Orderlies reportedly allowed soldiers from the nearby base to access the wards at night. The female inmates, heavily sedated and legally voiceless, were allegedly subjected to systemic physical and psychological exploitation by the unsupervised staff. Frances Farmer, still possessing the striking physical beauty that had made her a global icon, was highly visible. The rumors of the abuses she suffered in the darkness of those wards remain a dark, heavily contested stain on the historical record. The state hospital system has consistently denied these allegations, citing a lack of official documentation. But perpetrators of systemic violence do not keep meticulous records of their crimes. The sheer reality of a legally incompetent, sedated woman locked in an underfunded facility governed by unsupervised men creates an environment where atrocities are not just possible, they are inevitable. The hospital possessed an even darker threat for rebellious women, the transorbital lobotomy. Watching other female inmates return from the surgical wards as blank, drooling shells, Frances realized she had run out of moves. The threat of the ice pick forced her to execute the most agonizing, grueling performance of her entire career. She faked it. She swallowed her rage, manufactured a perfectly docile smile, and pretended to be broken just to survive. 5 years of forced institutionalization, high-voltage electroshock therapy, freezing ice baths, and systemic abuse accomplished their objective. The state achieved a psychological lobotomy. They systematically crushed the neural pathways of her resistance. They took a woman who had dared to read Karl Marx, who had dared to demand artistic integrity, who had dared to threaten the domestic tranquility of a Hollywood queen, and they pulverized her intellect until she forgot how to fight. The destruction was total. The home wrecker was permanently neutralized. While Frances Farmer was locked in a concrete ward, staring blankly at a wall, the architects of her destruction were flourishing in the blinding sunlight of the American elite. The contrast is sickening. It perfectly illustrates the absolute impunity of class privilege. Louise Rayner, the two-time Academy Award-winning Queen of the Golden Age, lived to be 104 years old. She spent her final decades in a luxurious apartment in the elite neighborhood of Eaton Square in London. She gave polite interviews to polite journalists. She was revered as a cinematic pioneer. She never answered for Frances Farmer. She was never forced to. Louise Rayner proved that the ultimate privilege of the ruling class is the weaponization of silence. She did not lower herself to engage in a public feud. She did not demand Frances be fired in front of witnesses. She simply applied the invisible, suffocating pressure of her corporate status onto her husband. She set the boundary, and she allowed the patriarchal system to enforce it. The moment she turned her back, the machine automatically mobilized to protect its most valuable asset. Louise Rayner kept her hands immaculately clean. She died a legend because she understood that in Hollywood, true power is the ability to outsource your violence. Clifford Odets, the champion of the proletariat, the fiery left-wing playwright who seduced Frances with the promise of artistic legitimacy, did not survive with his dignity intact. The system spared him the asylum, but it extracted its toll from his spine. By abandoning his mistress to appease his wealthy wife and protect his Hollywood income, Odets permanently castrated his own artistic soul. He proved to the studio executives that his left-wing principles were entirely negotiable. He became a highly paid, obedient stenographer for the very corporations he once claimed to despise. Clifford Odets was not locked in an asylum, but he locked himself in a cage of cowardice. The man who had proclaimed himself the champion of the working class spent the rest of his life eagerly selling out his friends and colleagues to the government just to keep his Beverly Hills mansion and his studio paychecks. He lived as a wealthy parasite on the capitalist machine, and he died choking on it at the age of 57. The legacy of Frances Farmer is one of the most deliberately distorted narratives in American pop culture. For decades, the industry peddled the lie that she was a tragic victim of her own mental illness, a beautiful starlet who simply snapped under the pressure of fame. That narrative is a corporate cover-up. Frances Farmer was not mentally ill. She was furious. She was a highly intelligent, fiercely independent woman who recognized the studio system for the exploitative meat grinder that it was. She demanded decent scripts. She demanded artistic autonomy. She refused to act as a docile, smiling commodity. And when she threatened the domestic security of the Hollywood elite by sleeping with Clifford Odets, she crossed the invisible red line. Her destruction was a calculated necessity for the system. Paramount Pictures could not simply fire her. They had to discredit her. If an intelligent, articulate star walked away from the studio and exposed the grueling 14-hour workdays, the forced amphetamines, and the rampant exploitation, it would threaten the entire economic model of the industry. So they diagnosed her anger as insanity. This is the most insidious weapon of a patriarchal autocracy. When a woman refuses to comply, you do not debate her. You pathologize her. You label her hysterical. You label her erratic. By branding Frances Farmer a lunatic, the studios invalidated every critique she ever made about the industry. They transformed a whistleblower into a psychiatric patient. The horrors she endured at Western State Hospital, the freezing hydrotherapy, the hundreds of volts of electroshock therapy, the physical abuse and the forced labor were not medical treatments. They were punitive measures. The asylum functioned as the penal colony for the Hollywood studio system. It was the place where they sent the defective merchandise to be biologically reprogrammed. The system did not just want to punish Frances, it wanted to make an example of her. Her fate was an implicit, terrifying warning broadcast to every other actress on the Paramount lot. Comply, or we will erase your mind. When Frances was finally released, the system had achieved total victory. She was stripped of her wealth, her civil rights, and her neurological fire. The woman who had commanded the screen was reduced to scrubbing soiled sheets in the basement laundry of a Seattle hotel. The elite had physically dragged the working-class upstart back down to the gutter. They carved a permanent bleeding scar into her life, ensuring she would serve out her remaining days as a broken, heavily medicated cautionary tale. There is no justice in the story of Frances Farmer. The villains won. Louise Rayner maintained her elite isolation. Clifford Odets preserved his studio income. Frances Farmer remained locked in the state ward. The machinery of the 1940s had successfully neutralized the threat. But the story of Frances Farmer does not end in the darkness of Western State Hospital. It ends with the brutal, heartbreaking reality of her eventual release. When the state finally decided they had extracted enough punishment, they opened the iron doors. They released a woman who no longer recognized the world and who the world no longer wanted. The final chapter of Frances Farmer is the definitive proof that the Hollywood system does not just kill careers. It leaves a permanent bleeding scar on the American cultural landscape. The iron gates of Western State Hospital did not open because of a medical breakthrough. They did not open because the psychiatric establishment suddenly recognized the humanity of their prisoner. The gates opened on March 23, 1950, because the state of Washington determined that Frances Farmer was no longer a threat to the established order. She had been incarcerated, drugged, shocked, and systematically brutalized for nearly 5 years. The system had successfully extracted the rebellion from her nervous system. She was paroled not as a cured patient, but as a neutralized asset. The mechanism of her release was as cruel as the mechanism of her capture. The state did not grant her independence. They transferred the legal deed of her existence. Frances, still classified as legally incompetent, was released into the permanent custody of her mother, Lillian Farmer. This detail represents the ultimate suffocating triumph of the patriarchal control structure. Lillian Farmer was not a savior. She was the architect of the initial institutionalization. She was the woman who had originally signed the commitment papers, working in tandem with the studio fixers and the Los Angeles judges to lock her own daughter away. The system effectively deputized the mother to act as the warden. Frances traded a concrete cell guarded by male orderlies for a childhood bedroom guarded by the woman who had betrayed her. The state outsourced the surveillance to the family unit. Frances Farmer returned to Seattle, a ghost. The physical transformation was a brutal testament to the violence of mid-century institutional care. The glamorous, razor-sharp Hollywood icon who had commanded the screen in Come and Get It. The woman whose aggressive beauty had threatened the elite security of Louise Rayner no longer existed. The camera would not recognize her. The heavy, relentless regimen of psychiatric sedatives had slowed her metabolism and added weight to her frame. The hundreds of rounds of high-voltage electroshock therapy had left a permanent, visible sluggishness in her motor functions. The fierce, defiant spark in her eyes, the intellect that had dared to argue with studio executives and critique the capitalist structure of the film industry, was extinguished, replaced by a hollow, terrified vacancy. The medical establishment had physically altered her cellular structure. They had engineered a perfectly docile citizen. The Hollywood machine, operating 3,000 miles away, ignored her release entirely. The corporate apparatus that had utilized her body to generate millions of dollars, the publicity department that had manufactured her public destruction, and the executives who had invoked the morals clause to legally discard her, did not issue a statement. The syndicated columnists Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper, who had gleefully participated in her public execution, found new targets. Frances Farmer was erased from the industry ledger. She was a closed account. Stripped of her profession, her legal autonomy, and her reputation, she was forced to enter the absolute lowest tier of the American labor market. From an A-list movie star earning thousands of dollars a week, Frances was demoted to sorting laundry in the subterranean basement of the Olympic Hotel. Her hands, which had once signed lucrative studio contracts, were plunged into vats of industrial bleach, washing the soiled bedsheets and discarded filth of the very same wealthy elite who had destroyed her. She worked in silence. She kept her head down. She lived in a state of perpetual, vibrating paranoia, terrified that any display of anger would result in her being dragged back to the freezing baths of the asylum. The system was not finished extracting its pound of flesh. In the ultimate act of televised humiliation, the industry dragged a heavily medicated Frances onto national television. On the program, This Is Your Life, they ambushed her. They forced her to look directly into the camera, smile, and publicly thank the very medical establishment that had tortured her. She had to swallow her own truth and broadcast a corporate lie just to earn the right to exist. The grueling performance of sanity could not last. She retreated into alcohol to numb the lingering horrors of the asylum, eventually dying of esophageal cancer in total isolation at the age of 56. Her death did not warrant the front pages of the Hollywood trade papers. There were no elaborate memorials held on the sound stages of Culver City. The elite power structure that had systematically orchestrated her annihilation, from the aristocratic wife to the cowardly playwright to the corporate executives, had already moved on. They had successfully contained the threat. They had proven the absolute unyielding rule of the Hollywood caste system. The destruction of Frances Farmer is not an anomaly. It is the operating manual. It demonstrates the precise clinical methodology used by the capitalist elite to eliminate working class resistance. When you strip away the glamour, the Academy Awards, and the sanitized biographies, the story of Frances Farmer, Louise Rayner, and Clifford Odets is a blueprint of systemic violence. It proves that the most dangerous weapon in Hollywood is not a bad review or a canceled contract. The most dangerous weapon is the medical establishment, wielded as a blunt instrument by the ruling class. The elite do not need to silence you. They simply label you insane, lock you in a concrete box, and let the state burn the rebellion out of your skull. The machine survived. The machine thrived. And as the decades progressed, the studios would refine their methods, realizing that they didn't need to lock women in asylums if they could just control their chemistry from the inside out. The tragedy of Frances Farmer was the bloody prologue to the ultimate pharmacological horror show of the modern era. The systemic destruction of Frances Farmer required no single executioner. No single individual pulled a trigger. No executive drafted a memo ordering her destruction. No hitman was hired to dispose of the body. That is the terrifying brilliance of the Iron Curtain of Hollywood capitalism. The elite did not need to break the law to eliminate a working class threat. They simply utilized the law. They aligned the immense interlocking gears of the studio system, the syndicated press, the municipal police, and the American medical establishment, and they let the machine do the crushing. The legacy of the Paramount Triad is not a romantic tragedy. It is a masterclass in class warfare and systemic immunity. The destruction of Frances Farmer was the bloody, violent prototype. What followed was the industrialization of that destruction. The system had perfected the art of eliminating a rebel. Now, it was ready to turn its attention to its most valuable, compliant properties. It was time to manufacture copies. What happens when a studio decides that a human being is too expensive and decides to literally engineer a biological clone to replace her? What happens when two women are pumped full of amphetamines and pitted against each other in a race that can only end in the morgue?